Hello, this is DeEtta Jones, and today I want to talk about the definitions of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Just last week, I was in a conversation with some of our Inclusive Managers Toolkit participants, and the question came up, can you please define what you mean by diversity, inclusion, and equity? It took me back for a minute because we had been kind of rolling along in this course. We had done a lot of kind of laying the path. We had been describing to people what the course is about and the fact that it's about enhancing your managerial effectiveness, making sure that you as managers and leaders have a toolkit of resources available, and also that all of that work is framed under the auspices of being as inclusive as possible and really trying to live out our diversity, inclusion, and equity values in our organization. So it was at first surprising to me when the question came up, and then I realized every single person, of course, defines diversity, inclusion, and equity differently. And also, over time, those definitions have changed. And within organizational contexts, those words are used differently. And so I really, on reflection, think that it's an incredibly valid point and really was excited to be able to talk a little bit with the group about my definitions of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and also then invite them to think about how diversity, inclusion, and equity play out in their own organizations. And so what I've done here is I've provided some narrative that gives my descriptions of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and I invite you to read those along with watching this video. From my point of view, diversity has typically and traditionally in the US context focused most heavily on either the dimensions of an individual's identities, the differences across either individuals and or groups from different kind of societal perspectives, and or representation goals. In organizations, often when we have, especially in the past, thought about diversity, what we've really been saying is what we need to do is have X number of this and Y number of that and X number of this as far as representation. And so it could be veterans or women or people with disabilities or persons of color, or breaking that down more granularly, people representing very specific racial and ethnic groups. So diversity to me has typically been a little bit more shallow as far as thinking about the external representation of individuals. I'm not saying that diversity isn't important. What I mean is that the way that it's played out as an organizational priority and as far as the way that we resource it and measure it has been a little bit more shallow in my perspective. Inclusion is different than diversity. Inclusion is a practice. It's about behaviors. It's about the way that we communicate, the way that we coach, the way that we give feedback, the way that we design and facilitate meeting agendas, the way that we communicate through change, the way that we do performance evaluations, the way that we do hiring and onboarding. So to me, inclusion is really about the behavioral choices that we make individually and also collectively. Inclusion to me is not in addition to our real work as leaders and managers. It's not, I want to be a really competent and effective manager, and oh, by the way, what are some things that I do to be more inclusive? They are all part of the same portfolio of expectations, in my opinion. And inclusion is just the lens where you think about the how. How is it that we make sure that we are bringing spaces together that allow people to bring them full selves, here to contribute fully, to be heard and authentically valued? How is it that we communicate so that we are taking we are acknowledging and trying to reposition power dynamics and share power differently in the spaces than maybe what has traditionally been the case in many of our spaces. Equity. Equity is more about systems. So equity is acknowledging and then finding ways to interrogate and revise systems or structures that get in the way of people being able to fully participate in whatever space it is that they want to participate and that we are actively trying to create together. So here's the thing about equity. The way that I describe this in the narrative is that equity has, in the United States at least, and also in other countries that have been doing equity-based work, typically been done through what I call a deficit-based model. A deficit-based model is an assumption, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that there are certain individuals and or groups who have less ability to compete and to contribute currently because of some historic marginalization or exclusion. that historic marginalization could be legal and or social. There are plenty of ways in which we have been trying to build programs and initiatives and fund deficit-based models and programs. So scholarships or targeted mentoring programs, targeted high potential development programs, those sorts of things where we're saying this group of people needs extra special help from us, whoever us is, at doling out the resources so that they can get up to a level playing field. That's one way of thinking about it. Here's the tricky part about deficit-based equity. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable over time. It doesn't work all by itself. And so it is incredibly important that we think about the fact that one, historic underrepresentation, marginalization, and exclusion is real. It really has happened and it continues to happen. And two, we definitely need to find ways to make sure that people who have not had access to resources and experiences and structures do have access. And what that will likely mean is that we need to continue to find additional resources, right, to help support some of that more equitable distribution of access. In addition, though, the tricky part about the way that we've been doing deficit-based equity is that it's oftentimes reinforcing a connection or a relationship between the individual or group that is in the deficient space and the norm, right? It's reinforcing this imbalanced power structure that is really problematic. You know, if I am, because I am brown and because I am woman, in one of these categories or multiple categories where people think I need extra help in order to compete against the norm, then those resources might be useful to me. But the tricky part is that I am forever spending my time like this, with my hand out asking for more resources. And this person or this group or this decision maker is always the one that decides when and how and if I get access to those resources, right? And so it's not, the problem isn't that I need the resources. The problem is that I always have to go back to these individuals and or structures that have power over me because they're part of the norm as far as the amount or types or level or timing of the resources that I have access to. A way to shift that framework is a more contemporary way to think about equity, where what we're really doing is interrogating the systems and the structures. And it's not just here and now, but we're also taking into consideration the fact that history has led us to make some choices that are incredibly biased, that have negative implications even to this day in 2020, and that some of us are going to have to do the very hard work of interrogating and maybe even tearing down some of those systems, really unraveling the systems that have been layered up over time with bias and with marginalization and with exclusion in ways that say, you know what, these systems really need to be totally revised in order for us to be able to have the kind of equitable environment that we espouse. So as you think about your work as managers and as leaders, as you think about the diversity and inclusion and equity strategy work that your organization is pursuing, I encourage you to think about some of those definitions and think about, to what extent is your organization really focused on diversity? A lot of times when we say diversity, what we really need are things like recruitment and retention, right? To what extent are we really focused on inclusion? That has to do with the practices that every single one of us has responsible for displaying. How are we teaching those practices? How are we reinforcing them? How are we building accountability structures? How are we making sure that they are integrated and sustainable as the core way that we do our work? And then also, how is it that we are approaching equity? What systems are we doing deep dives into to understand what the root cause is of some of the discrepancies that exist in our organization? And then how is it that we are allocating resources, not just now, but over time, to dismantling some of those dysfunctional structures and systems and finding ways to create more equitable access? By the way, creating equitable access means that we're going to have to share space. Those of us who have been in the power situations or privileged roles in the past are going to have to share space. You alone or I alone, regardless of who you are from a position of power, are not going to be able to stand back, look at the systems, and then make absolute judgment about what needs to change, what's broken, and how to fix it, right? We need to be able to create more space and create inclusive spaces where people who have traditionally been marginalized or excluded are now coming to the table, fully contributing to this understanding of what the system's problems are, and also finding solutions that work differently and informed by people who have been underrepresented by those very systems. So as you continue to do your work, I invite you to think about your own definitions. I invite you to share some of your definitions that might be different than what I just described here, and post them. We'd love to hear your comments on our blog, on YouTube, on LinkedIn. We'd absolutely love to hear from you, because all of us, I think, are really in this learning journey together. Okay, enjoy. Have a great week.